The small town that hid a body for 20 years. In small towns, silence doesn't always mean peace. Sometimes it means agreement. Agreement to look away. Agreement not to ask certain questions. Agreement to accept a story that feels thin, because the truth would be unbearable. For nearly 20 years, this town lived with a secret buried so deep it became part of the landscape. A body hidden, a death unspoken, and a community that learned, slowly, deliberately, how not to remember. This is not just the story of a missing person. It's the story of how an entire town decided what mattered and what didn't. The town sits miles from the nearest highway, the kind of place drivers pass without noticing. One main road. A diner that closes early. Church bells that mark time better than clocks. Everyone knows everyone, or at least everyone knows of everyone. In towns like this, crimes don't feel real. They happen somewhere else. On the news. In cities with sirens and shadows. Here doors stayed unlocked. Children rode bikes until dark. And when something went wrong, people believed it would fix itself. Until the day someone didn't come home. The person at the center of this story, let's call them Alex, wasn't famous. They weren't wealthy. They weren't powerful. They were known for routines. Morning coffee at the same counter. A wave to the same neighbor. A predictable life that made their absence immediately noticeable and somehow easier to explain away. Alex was last seen on an ordinary afternoon. No struggle. No argument. No public scene. Just a person walking into a day that never ended. When night fell and Alex didn't return, concern flickered, but briefly. Because small towns are good at rationalizing. They probably went to stay with family. Maybe they needed a break. They'll call. They never did. The initial search lasted less than a week. A few volunteers. A few police cruisers. A few questions asked politely, without urgency. There were no helicopters. No forensic teams. No press conferences. Just enough effort to say something had been done. And then it slowed. Not because there were no leads, but because the leads pointed in uncomfortable directions. Toward people who were respected. Toward families with history. Toward connections no one wanted to examine too closely. In small towns, investigations don't just seek truth. They seek harmony. And harmony was winning. Within months, Alex stopped being a person and became a theory. Some said Alex ran away. Others said debt. A secret life. A fresh start. Every version had one thing in common. It removed responsibility. Because if Alex chose to disappear, then no one had failed them. No one had ignored warning signs. No one had to answer hard questions. The town repeated these stories until they sounded like facts. And eventually, even Alex's name faded. But not everyone forgot. Alex's remaining family lived outside town limits, far enough to be seen as outsiders, but close enough to feel the judgment. They kept asking questions, kept calling investigators, kept pushing for records, and quietly they were labeled difficult. In small towns, persistence looks like accusation. An accusation threatens the social order. So doors closed. Calls went unanswered. And the message became clear. Stop digging. Hear what outsiders often misunderstand about places like this. Secrets don't survive because people are cruel. They survive because people are close. The same officers went to school with the same witnesses. The same officials shared pews with the same suspects. The same families intermarried, worked together, buried their dead together. To expose the truth wouldn't just implicate one person. It would implicate everyone who stayed silent. And silence is easier than reckoning. Time passed. Businesses changed hands. New families moved in, unaware of what lay beneath the soil. But land remembers. A wooded area on the edge of town, once ignored, later fenced, developed an uneasy reputation. Animals avoided it. Plants grew unevenly. Locals joked about it. Deflected curiosity. Because jokes are shields. And beneath that ground, something waited. Nearly 20 years later, the mistake happened. Not a confession. Not an arrest. A routine decision. A development permit. A surveyor's report. A piece of land finally disturbed. The first sign wasn't dramatic. No bones in plain sight. Just something that didn't belong. And suddenly the past, long suppressed, demanded attention. Law enforcement returned. This time with tools. This time with outside eyes. This time without the luxury of pretending. As news spread, the town reacted in unison. Shock publicly. Fear privately. Because people realized something terrifying. They hadn't just lived near a secret. They had lived on top of it. Every conversation was suddenly measured. Every memory re-examined. Every silence questioned. And the same people who once said, "It's none of our business," now wondered what their silence had cost. Authorities confirmed what many had always suspected, but never dared say aloud. The body had been there nearly 20 years. Preserved by soil. Protected by silence. And immediately, the official narrative began forming. A lone suspect. An isolated incident. A tragedy but contained. But the evidence told a different story. Because no one hides a body for 20 years without help. Without knowledge. Without complicity. This wasn't just a crime. It was a collaboration. Old interviews were revisited. Statements compared. And suddenly, contradictions emerged. Timelines shifted. Memories sharpened or collapsed. People who barely knew Alex remembered very specific things too late. The town's past began turning on itself. And that's when one name resurfaced. A name that had been mentioned early on. Then quietly dismissed. A person still living there. Still respected. Still protected. As investigators prepared to reopen the case fully, residents realized something chilling. The body wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning. Because uncovering how Alex died would mean asking why no one spoke. And answering that would expose more than a killer. It would expose a town. A system. A culture. And a choice made every day for 20 years to value peace over truth. When the body was finally uncovered, investigators expected answers. What they found instead were echoes. Echoes of conversations never recorded. Of decisions made quietly. Of moments when someone could have spoken and didn't. Because bodies don't just reveal how someone died. They reveal who helped them disappear. And in this town, the dead were about to expose the living. There was one name that kept surfacing. It appeared in early notes from the original investigation, thin, half-finished. It appeared in old tip logs, marked unsubstantiated. It appeared in whispers that stopped the moment outsiders walked into the room. Let's call him Mark. Mark wasn't a drifter. He wasn't a stranger. He was local. Born there. Raised there. He coached youth sports. Volunteered at town events. Helped neighbors fix fences and roofs. And 20 years ago, Mark was one of the last people to see Alex alive. Back then, Mark had an explanation. A simple one. Too simple. He said Alex left upset. Said there was tension, but nothing serious. Said he hadn't seen Alex after that. And for reasons no one would admit out loud, investigators accepted it. Because Mark wasn't just a resident. He was someone's cousin, someone's former classmate, someone's church friend. And pressing him would have meant pressing everyone. So they didn't. When investigators reopened the case, Mark was older, grayer, slower, but still confident. At first, he repeated the same story, word for word. But something was different this time. This time, the questions didn't stop. They asked him to walk through the day again. Asked him to describe where he stood, what Alex said, which direction Alex walked. And slowly cracks appeared. He hesitated, corrected himself, changed small details he didn't realize mattered. Details only someone who remembered too much would struggle with. Then investigators found someone else, a witness no one had ever formally interviewed. Not because they didn't exist, but because no one had asked. This witness lived just outside town limits, worked odd hours, kept to themselves. They remembered seeing Alex that night, and they remembered Mark's vehicle nearby, parked where it shouldn't have been. For 20 years, they carried that memory like a weight, unsure if it mattered, unsure if it was safe to say, until the body was found. When investigators asked why the witness stayed silent, the answer wasn't fear of Mark. It was fear of the town, fear of being labeled a liar, a troublemaker, an outsider stirring up old wounds. In small towns, being believed is less about truth and more about belonging. And this witness never truly belonged. As pressure mounted, investigators re-examined the original case file. And what they found was troubling. Statements missing signatures. Follow-up interviews never conducted. Tips marked resolved with no explanation. Someone had made decisions. Not to pursue. Not to escalate. Not to document. It wasn't negligence. It was choice. One name appeared again and again at the bottom of those pages. A former officer. Long retired. Still living locally. He had been respected, trusted, considered steady. When questioned, he claimed limited memory. But records showed something else. He had closed the lead involving Mark himself. No supervisor override. No external review. Just a quiet conclusion that the lead went nowhere. And suddenly, the case wasn't just about murder. It was about protection. As rumors spread, the town grew defensive. People accused investigators of rewriting history, of bringing shame, of digging up pain for nothing. Mark's supporters spoke loudly. Alex's family did not. They had learned long ago that speaking only brought more silence. But investigators now understood something critical. This wasn't a case of one man hiding a body. This was a case of a town choosing who deserved scrutiny and who didn't. Then came the discovery that shifted everything. A piece of physical evidence, long overlooked, was re-examined using modern techniques. It placed Mark near the burial site. Not conclusively, but convincingly. Enough to reopen lines of questioning. Enough to unsettle people who had felt safe for decades. Enough to make the town realize this time the truth might not be containable. Mark returned for another interview. This time, his confidence was gone. He asked questions, wanted to know who had talked, what they knew. And then, almost casually, he said something investigators hadn't asked about. A detail from the burial site. A detail that had never been public. The room went quiet. Because innocent people don't know details they were never told. At this point, investigators believed they knew who killed Alex. But that wasn't the hardest part. The hardest part was proving who helped afterward, who looked away, who closed files, who discouraged witnesses, and most importantly, who still believed keeping the secret was more important than justice. For 20 years, the town believed the hardest part was keeping the secret. They were wrong. The hardest part was living with what the secret turned them into. Because once the silence cracked, it didn't just reveal a crime. It revealed a pattern. And patterns don't belong to one person. They belong to everyone who maintained them. Mark was brought in again. This time, there were no pleasantries, no small-town familiarity, no assumptions of trust. Investigators laid out the timeline slowly. They showed him where his statements changed, where witness memories overlapped, where physical evidence refused to align with his story. Mark listened, and for the first time in 2 decades, he stopped talking. Silence, once his shield, had become his enemy. What followed wasn't a dramatic admission. There were no tears, no full acknowledgement of guilt. Instead, there was something more unsettling. Partial truth. Mark admitted to an argument, admitted things got out of hand, admitted he panicked, but he never used the word killed. Because even now, the town had taught him something powerful. If you don't name it, maybe it won't fully exist. As the case moved forward, attention shifted to what happened next. The burial site wasn't close. It wasn't accidental. It required time, equipment, knowledge. Investigators believed Mark didn't act alone. And while no one else was charged directly, evidence suggested quiet cooperation. A borrowed tool returned without comment. A vehicle loaned without questions. A report never written. No single act that screamed guilt. Just many small choices aligned. The retired officer was questioned again. This time under oath. He denied wrongdoing. Said he used his discretion. Said there was no evidence back then. But when confronted with the inconsistencies, his answer slowed. And then he said something revealing. I didn't think it would help anyone to keep pushing. In that sentence, the town's philosophy was laid bare. Not what was true, but what was convenient. Mark was formally charged. The announcement didn't bring relief. It brought discomfort. People avoided eye contact at the diner. Families argued behind closed doors. Long-held loyalties fractured. Because justice, when delayed, doesn't feel triumphant. It feels accusatory. It asks questions people thought they'd buried forever. Alex's family attended every hearing. They didn't celebrate. They didn't speak to the press. They had already done their grieving in slow motion. Year after year without answers. For them, justice wasn't closure. It was confirmation that they hadn't imagined the loss. That Alex had mattered. That the silence hadn't erased the truth. The town lost something too. Not innocence, that was gone long ago. They lost the illusion that silence is neutral. Because silence doesn't preserve peace. It preserves power. And power left unchecked always chooses itself. The trial was restrained. No spectacle. No shocking revelations. Just methodical proof. Mark was convicted. But no verdict could account for 20 stolen years. No sentence could undo the shared decision to look away. And no courtroom could hold everyone responsible. Today the town still stands. The diner still serves coffee. The church bells still ring. But something has changed. People speak more carefully now. Not out of fear, but out of awareness. They understand that secrets don't disappear. They wait, and they demand payment. This wasn't just a story about a body hidden in the ground. It was about a truth hidden in plain sight. A reminder that crimes don't survive because they're clever. They survive because they're protected. And the most dangerous lie a community can tell itself is this: it's not our responsibility. Because in the end, the body didn't expose the town. The silence did. If you were there, if you knew, if you stayed quiet, the question isn't what would you have done then? It's what you'll do next time. If you value calm, investigative true crime storytelling, subscribe to Arcana Casefiles.